Good afternoon and welcome to the Art Gallery of Ontario. My name is Audrey Hudson and I'm the Richard and Elizabeth Currie Chief of Education and Programming here at the AGO. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement and just acknowledging where the land of the AGO is on. So the land the AGO is on is Michi-Sagaig Anishinaabe Territory, Mississauga. It is also governed by a treaty between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Canadian government. Toronto is Michi-Sagaig Anishinaabe territory. It has been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat Confederacies. Whenever I do a land acknowledgement, I like to consider my positionality on this land, how I work, how I live, how I create, and how I learn, being sure to honor the ancestors, my ancestors that came before me, and recognizing those who will come, the future generations that will come after me. So today our talk is on a continued conversation on residential schools. So I'm going to be joined today by three panelists, and I will introduce the panelists, and then we will get started. So today Robert is Métis from Ontario and French. He is queer, gay, and is currently vice principal at Wandering Spirit School within the Toronto District School Board. Hello, Robert. Thank you.
Audrey, thanks for inviting me.
Next, I have Jenny Kay Dupuis. Jenny Kay is a multi-award winning Indigenous author, educator, and artist. Hello, Jenny.
Hi there.
Thank you. And I have Lindsay Equal Knight. Lindsay is an award-winning hip-hop performing artist living in Saskatoon, originally from Muskoti First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. Hi, Lindsay.
Danse. Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, today's talk, as I said, it is a continued conversation on residential schools. And I want to take a moment before we get into our talk and before we get into our conversation, I do want to take a moment of pause for the 215 children that were found at Kamloops Indian Residential School. And I want to think about the parents, the aunties, the uncles, the grandparents, and other kin and whose babies never came home. I want to honor the memory of their young lives, the residential school survivors, and the resilience of their families. So let's take a moment of pause. Thank you. So this talk, as I said, will be centered on a continued conversation about residential schools in Canada and the available resources within the AGO's collection. This discussion is for students, teachers, parents, and anyone who wants to continue, and having these culturally safe conversations with art. So we're starting with art. Everyone here on the call is an artist and educator in their own right, and so including myself. And so this panel really is going to be talking about broaching these subjects, these bold subjects with art. So let's begin. All right. So I'm going to start with a question on, could you share how you've entered these conversations with young children? So could you share how you enter the conversation with residential schools with young children? And it can be any age group, I know, and we do work across different age groups. So whatever your area is, please, you can speak to that. And you can also, if you'd like to introduce, if you'd like to do a little bit more of an introduction of yourself, please feel free to do that. So let's start with, should I start with Jenny Kay?
Certainly. Thanks very much for having me here. So in terms of thinking about how I chose to enter the conversations, particularly with young children, it was a lot of years of reflection and thinking about different ways or approaches that people have taken. And one of the ways that really touched me was the impact that children's picture books have. So I wanted to take a community story, my family story, truth, and look at a way to share it with young children, but also think about the opportunities that it has to bring it into various spaces with not just young children, but also adults as well too. So in writing that story, I think we really looked at ways that we can we can do it in a responsible way, in a respectful way. And I'll share some of that today as we talk.
Good. Thank you. And your book, do you want to, I just want to, yeah, in your book, do you want to talk about your book?
Sure. So
Please.
yeah, certainly. So we published the book, Second Story published the book, I'm Not a Number, a little over 5 years ago. And it's the story of my grandmother's experience being taken from our home community, Nipissing First Nation, and being taken north to Spanish Residential School with herself and her brothers. And it focuses on different experiences that she had at the school. And then it also talks about how she returned back home to her community and how the community, members of the community, particularly her parents, stood up against an Indian agent who wanted her to return to the school. So it's definitely a story about resilience. It's a story about family strength, and it's definitely a story about community values as well too.
Great, thank you. Lindsay, would you like to go next?
Just unmute. Tansikakyo, yeah, it's really it's an honor to be amongst all of you today and to be asked to be a part of this. It's it's been a really hard week and a really hard year, a really hard couple of years, and we've sort of we've been given this week to kind of process and shift our energies and as with any kind of time, we would get a chance to really think about what's important and how we need to move forward with this. But as for my kids and of course, Jenny, I'm very familiar with your book, and that my kids are very familiar with it too. I read it as soon as it came out, that this is the one they're going to hear. Because we have to be really careful as Indigenous parents how we share these stories and these the news. For a lot of non-Indigenous kids and students in schools, this can be the first time they're hearing about it, or they can hear about it, but it's not them. It's still separate from their reality and experience. And for my kids, I guess I'll talk about my own two little ones. I have an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, and for my kids, they're immersed in the intergenerational effects of residential school. My grandparents went to residential school. My dad is a day school survivor, only recently talking about that and his experiences there. But we're, raising these kids in a good way and trying really hard to talk about the beauty of our kin and our family and who we are and the positive stories. So when things like this are exposed, a lot of our people already know these stories. They're nothing. It's not a shock. It's not a surprise. We've heard a lot of these stories firsthand within our kinship systems. But I'm really careful with what I share with my little ones because they are, they're brown, walking in this world right now in the middle of what is now known as Saskatchewan, and it's hard. There's a lot of racism here. There's a lot of hatred. There's a lot of settler colonial power, and there's a lot of disagreement over land and what land means. So with these stories, I was hesitant to give. We just took it down yesterday, but at one of the Catholic churches, we had the shoes, lined up, and my first, instinct is to, as an activist, I always like to be right in those spaces, and I always take my kids right in those spaces. But this time I was hesitant, and I didn't take them, and because I decided, and there's no textbook that explains how to parent, in these situations, but I decided not to take them because I didn't feel like they needed to see that. A lot of us Indigenous parents will have different opinions about that, but for me, I just thought, they've heard enough, they've seen enough, and let's, I don't know if this is for them to to see. So we did it in our own way. We did our own ceremony and prayer. And then they go to school and I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm just, as I think about it, they go to school here, and the school spent the week, learning a lot about the schools and the system, and it's just, yeah, it's something that we're just boldly going in this direction, and as a society, and we're not sure yet, what's right and wrong and how to approach these things as Indigenous parents and educators, and educating Indigenous children. We have to be careful how we tell those stories. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, and these really personal stories. Yeah, thank you. Robert, would you like to
Sure.
go next?
Thanks for inviting me into the space. It's quite an honor to be here with other panelists whose work I share with other educators to engage in conversation and learning. So one of the things that I think about being in my role as an instructional leader for Indigenous education, and then as a vice principal at a school where many of the students and families identify as Indigenous of either First Nation, Métis, Inuit mix of, is the ways that we approach it, right? So it's about understanding your students and really being responsive to your students, and just picking up on something that Lindsay was just saying, that maybe at some point for some families and students, they aren't really ready to engage right now in that conversation because it is very personal and it affects them through intergenerational trauma. But then also thinking about how do we engage in these conversations across, because students, regardless of age, are engaging with media in certain ways, whether it's social media, television, radio, and hearing the stories and seeing things and have questions. And I know when I was a classroom teacher and students came in with questions, I wanted to be able to talk with them, but also thinking about how do I do this in a way that's safe. And so I'm just thinking of one of the ways that I would approach, say, Orange Shirt Day before the news from last week. It's one of the ways that I would do it is thinking about having students in the younger grades particularly think about personal connections. And so one of the things that I would suggest would be like have students think of something that's really like an article of clothing that's very special to them, and draw it and tell that story and tell their story. And then read the book Phyllis's Orange Shirt around Phyllis Webstat and the starting of Orange Shirt Day to engage in that work. The reason why I always like to start with students first is that way they can have a story that's theirs that they think about. And so they're not appropriating the lives of other people. And particularly, I'm scattered with my thoughts just because there's so many things I'm thinking of. It's because some of the work that I really do is because given the history here on what's called Canada, Turtle Island, and with the history of residential schools, 60s scoop that's ongoing, missing murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, people couldn't be at certain times because it meant horrific things. And so we don't ever want to students imagine that they are Indigenous. Instead, start with their stories. And I think people starting off to engage in this work of Indigenous education, Indigenous sovereignty, let's start to make personal connections so that we aren't appropriating the voice of or trying to be the voice of First Nation, Métis, or Inuit peoples.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a question that, we get all the time. How do I begin, or how do I talk about Indigenous art without appropriating? And and that's really great. That's a really great starting point. Thinking about these personal stories. Personal story. Thinking about the orange shirt and explaining it to my daughter, who's 6.5, and so and grandma, right? And her grandma are tight, and so she was like, "Oh, her grandma gave her that." I'm like, "Yeah." And that just stuck with her. And so now, and then when she saw, when she saw the news and we openly talk about it, she was like, "Oh, is this the grandma and the orange shirt?" I'm like, "Yes, yes," and just like, yeah, just thinking about Lindsay, like how much do you share? How much do you, the news is out, it's in the news, it's everywhere, it's inundating us. And so, how much and even, and just, protecting babies a little bit, just a tiny bit more, but also educating about the truth about our nation, about what is happening. I think that's really that balance. And yeah, there's no textbook for parenting. So I think it really is up to each parent or caregiver or and even teacher to be responsive to students. So thank you. And so we got into a little bit of thinking about how do we ensure that cultural safety, or how do we ensure we are having culturally safe conversations. And Robert, I know that a lot of the work that you do with Wandering Spirit is about having, and a lot of work that all of you are doing is about having those culturally safe conversations. And I know that you've done a lot of this work recently, but also in the past. So maybe could you start us off, and how do we ensure that that we are not re-traumatizing, that we are not even appropriating, or that we are not taking on someone else's trauma, and for these, for young kids, how does that, what does that look like, perhaps?
Thanks, Audrey. So I'm just going to let everyone know I'm a little nervous right now, so I'm a little shaky, and that's where the thoughts come in and out. But I'm making a few notes as I go to keep myself focused. So cultural safety, the concept of cultural safety started in medical communities in Australia, another place where colonization has wreaked havoc and still exists. And so cultural safety is also now expanding into education and other organizations that work with First Nation, Métis, Inuit peoples here in what's called Canada. And so when I think about cultural safety, it's not about being competent or having some sort of content knowledge. It's more about the ways that you create a space and conditions that students feel welcomed and safe. And so I think about some of the work also in culture relevant pedagogy. So I'm talking from an education stance here, whereas that students see themselves, their families and communities valued and affirmed, and that community is part of the learning. And so that instead of learning about, for example, Indigenous peoples, you're learning from Indigenous peoples, and it's a space where people are welcomed in. The stories are welcomed in positive, affirming ways. It's also being in consultation with community members so that things are done well and there's consultation done. And I think about like classroom spaces, and whether it be virtual, whether it be in person, whether it be kindergarten or university, is a culturally safe space to me is one that talked about affirming people, valuing people, honoring people, meeting people where they're at and learning together, and being responsive to the learners in the space and being attuned to them holistically. So how do students, not only their minds, but their bodies, their hearts, their spirit, making sure that that's attended to so that learning can happen in safer spaces. And particularly making sure that, I know a lot of times we have good intentions about going into speaking about topics like residential schools or other topics, but it's also making sure that we check our bias and our privileges when we walk into that space, because that can sometimes, there's no intention, someone doesn't intend to go and do something or say something that's really hurtful or triggering or traumatizing, but it happens when that doesn't happen. So cultural safety is like, when I work with people, sometimes people like a little checklist or a worksheet or something that just spells it out, but it's more than that. It's just a way of creating spaces where the dialogue can happen, and understanding that when you're responsive to the people you're learning with, because I consider myself as a a lead learner, like I'm a learner in the space still, and students and other teachers are my teachers too. And that to honor their gifts, and sometimes by honoring gifts, it's being responsive and knowing when to shut a conversation down for a bit. So I don't want to take up too much time because I want to hear what other people have to say too.
Thank you. Great. Jenny Kay, and I think we're, yeah, I'm nervous too. I'll just put it, so, um, yeah, so I think we're all, I mean, this is a tough conversation that we're having here. And so, I do have, immense gratitude to all of you for holding this space with me. Thank you. Jenny Kay, would you like to
Yeah, certainly.
say
I
something?
think I look at picture books themselves, and I'm going to refer back to picture books because that's sort of my what I want to focus on. Is I look at them as cultural documents, especially when we're telling the truth, when we're sharing family stories or community stories, or those that hold even cultural knowledge. So I look at it from that lens, and I also look at it from that lens, also the responsibility that comes with that when I write truth. So along with that is being careful of how I want to share a story. So looking at through the lens of cultural safety, or even trauma-informed, through a trauma-informed lens, or even the concept of an ethic of care lens. I think they're all sort of intertwined. Recognizing that the people that are reading these stories, they could be survivors themselves, it could be intergenerational survivors, or family members, and it could be people that are just learning it for the first time about those topics, or those realities. And in that case, I think when we were writing "I Am Not a Number," we were really, really careful of thinking about the messages that we wanted to share with that particular story, and what type of conversations we wanted to initiate, whether it's in schools or whether it's in libraries or community spaces. So we looked at it from the lens of, or I looked at it anyways, from the lens of thinking about the age group. So the book itself is ages 7 and up. So thinking of, you can have conversations about loss of culture, loss of language, and things along those lines. And so in this case, we chose certain narratives to include in the book. The idea that when my granny arrived at the school, they changed her name to a number. They also cut her hair, and the teachings that might go along with that. And as well, when they tried to stop her from speaking her language, and what conversations can come from that too. So we took things that would start conversations, and that was what we felt would be a safe way for whoever's taking that book and carrying on that cultural document per se, and passing on that knowledge and that story. So knowing where the book has gone over the years, I've heard stories from educators, from librarians, from parents, and from families who have used it in different ways. And cultural safety has been at the top of their mind for sure when you hear the stories and you hear the feedback of the ways that they've used it. For example, one father, shared photos with me of how he shared it with his children, but using it, thinking that they were a bit too young maybe to read the story and all the words within it. But he did a picture walk activity with them. So they explored the pictures and did some prompt questions, and he gave them opportunity. He did it very slowly and gave an opportunity for his children to ask questions, the why and the how and the what and those kind of things, right? Similarly, a school in Northern Ontario, or a school division in Northern Ontario, used it where they used art activities afterwards. So after reading through the book very slowly, and again, page by page, and sometimes over days, stopping at different parts and letting them think and reflect and go home and talk and those kind of things, and come back and ask questions and maybe doing further research. They were then given a bunch of art supplies, pipe cleaners, paper clips, sort of just paint, those kind of things. And they got to identify what their question was that they had, and then create an art response to go along with that. And then from that, they did an art gallery walk. And then thinking of older students that have used it, out of Hamilton, Ontario, a teacher led, Luke Bramer, thought about the way how you can safely explore it through drama. and in that case, he brought in the whole concept of students writing a script from it, asking permissions, thinking about ethics and protocols that might go along with it. And they worked in conjunction with me, sharing and asking those permissions and such along the way. And from that, they actually turned it into, they didn't become Irene, like my grandmother, and they didn't become the other characters in the book, but they did it from the lens of puppetry. And they learned about the idea of oppression and who takes on certain roles and those kind of things. And a really, really moving opportunity for those students to be able to walk through learning about the residential school system itself, because he didn't just isolate it to that story of the residential school system, but also brought in some pre-reading and pre-learning that talked about the scope of colonization and the Indian Act and other things around it. And then even coming out of it, the opportunity to learn about healing and remembrance and truth. So there's ways of doing it to promote and to support safe conversations and also safe learning as well too, with story work. And those are just some opportunities to consider.
Wow, that was great. Thank you so much. And Lindsay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hi for that. There's so much that I'm learning from the both of you, and I really like Robert, how you talk about the story. That giving students that opportunity to tell their story in their own way with their piece of clothing or whatnot. I find that, and then with the story work itself, Jenny, I find that the biggest shifts happen in these like creative artistic spaces, because the theme of the day, there's no textbook, but it's something that allows children, which are they're innately creative, they're innately like their imaginations are so strong. It allows them to sort of understand that narrative in their own way and on their own on their own terms. And so I love that idea, and as a as a lyricist and a hip-hop artist, that's what I've always used for my own way of understanding and experiencing my experiences and realities. So with that being said, I think that we use this power of art, and very fitting that we're sitting here with the AGO and talking about this and the curriculum guides that you have, because it's very effective. And one of the things that when I think about cultural safety, I think that when you have people like Robert and Jenny and Adrian and Carl who have created these pieces, and they've already vetted, they've already used protocol, they've already done the ceremony or whatever within your nations you do to do these things in a good way. So they gift the rest of us these things so that we can take them and understand them. And I think that they've done the work to create this cultural safety, and then we have these things that we can all see and we can all experience in our own ways, without taking them and appropriating them, but telling our own stories. So I think with culture and cultural safety, we need to really think about, as educators and whoever we are, whatever background we have, is to think about our own culture and our own cultural history, and deconstructing this Canadian narrative that does not work and has not worked for us. And that's the real hard task, because it means going in and really retelling those stories in different ways. And with children and young people, they're so smart. We all know this, as educators. They're so perceptive, and they catch on so quickly. And it's an opportunity. If we really want to see this shift, it's an opportunity for us to really share these truths and share these realities and tell our stories. Go over there and tell these truths within your own circles, start telling those stories, start telling these narratives that aren't, these colonial narratives, start telling those and start sharing those within your circles that don't even have a single Indigenous person in them. Just start telling them and start getting them out there. And I think that's where we're going to see that shift. And I'm also very nervous, so I'm kind of rambling, but I think in these types of conversations, we have to just, we have to just share and get it out. So, yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. And I think, telling those stories, Lindsay, like within hip hop is storytelling, right? Like, I mean, that's, an area, I mean, as a lyricist, but, and as a feeler, as a doer of and a creator of these art forms, like it is storytelling. And, for me, hearing this, I studied with Elder Eddie Benton Benet, who has since passed on, but up at Shingwalk, former residential school, and he was like, "Tell us your story." And I said, okay. And he actually even gave us, we learned to do our introduction in Anishinaabemowin. And he went around, there were about 30 of us, and he went around to every one of us and shared how to say your nation, or where your parents, where your ancestors are from. Like he went back and he's like, I remember he said this, there was 4 of us that had Jamaican heritage, and he's like, I'm going to tell you tomorrow. And we were like, okay. And so he came back and he had it written down on a little piece of paper, and it was, this is how you say it. And I'm like, okay. So then when we went around, we built this teaching lodge, and every day we would go around and say our introduction, because that's who you are. That's who you're walking with. And so then from that day on, I got to say Shemaim and Nis, Quay and Dow. Like it was just like he gifted that to me. And it was, I still have that little piece of paper. And it's I think he may have just sorry. Yeah, but it was just telling your story. And and he always said, he's like, yeah, Black people and Indigenous people, like, please, like, we are relatives. And so that really that really has stuck with me. So thank you. Um, and the next question I have is, and I'll combine my next 2 questions actually. What has prepared you to hold these spaces? And you've each touched on it a little bit, but what has prepared you to hold space for these bold, honest, truthful conversations that we're having now, and that we're always having, really, but even now in these moments of revelation. Maybe Lindsay, do you want to, or whoever wants to? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I can start. The first thing that I'll say about that is I'm very selective with where I share and who I share with and how I share, because it's the energy it takes to just process this within our own families and communities is daunting, and to share it outside of that is very important. If we have the emotional energy, it's important to do. So I always think about family and kin, and how our sort of kin networks can expand. And Audrey, when you asked me, I was, I think of you as, cousin. You're a cousin over there. So I know you're a safe, you're a safe space for me, and just working with, knowing that Robert and Jenny were gonna, like, I feel like it's important. We need to talk about it outside of our circles too, but those circles have to be safe, and here, just being here, and whoever else is sitting in our circle right now, I know you're here because you have that good energy and intention. So this is a safe space, and always just smudging. I use my medicine over here, and do a lot of like small ceremonies in my house and with my kids, and that, it really works. It really helps, and it helps us to move forward one step at a time. yeah, it really works. So I'm prepared. You know, I woke up this morning and I did that, and I asked, you know, to say things in a good way and to do this with good energy. And but also this is the only time that I'll be talking about this week, because I was asked for a couple more in my area and my community here, and I had to decline because I know how much energy, you know, I need to conserve for my kids who are so busy and so full of joy, and I don't want them to see me, you know, tattered. So are we combining those two questions? Because I'll maybe just share my last part too.
Yeah, sure. You
Yeah.
can keep going. I'll save that. Yeah, you can just keep going. Whatever you can say whatever you'd like to say.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you know, just being in this space and sharing is, I hope that we learn from this experience that we are all, you know, very powerful and very responsible and very capable to create that shift. I always use the word shift because it's not something that just like happens overnight. It's something that's gradual. But I know it's happening. I see it in these young kids, that my kids' friends that come home from school that are non-Indigenous, and they come here and they're asking questions, and they're, you know, eating a piece of moose meat and saying, "Oh, this is good," you know, stuff, little things that when I was a kid wouldn't happen. Hey, like there was a lot of shame. I really do everything I could to hide my indigeneity, and you know, having fair skin, it was easier for me to do. But I was very ashamed. I didn't want anyone to know. And now I see my kids come home with their, you know, little their non-Indigenous or white friends, and they're, you know, saying Nehiyaw words, and you know, just being very vocal about, you know, being Indig, and I just like, oh, this is awesome. So I see that shift, and let's keep going with it. Let's just keep going with this honest, open, bold, um, shifting the narratives way of doing things. So
Thank you. Okay. Robert, would you like to go next? And yeah, we can combine, yeah, let's combine the last two. Yeah, what has prepared you for these bold, honest conversations? And, you know, what do you hope people learn?
I'll share a bit of my story, just because I'm feeling the courage to do it. Is again, similar to Lindsay hiding that indigeneity. I look like a white guy, and that's how I go through life with that privilege. But also starting to understand my gayness and queerness in a place that isn't in a colonial structure that is very heteronormative and tries to define bodies and minds. And so my story of being in school and elementary school and secondary school is one of hiding who I was and feeling shameful about it, which still, of course, impacts me today sometimes. And so for me, I think about how art and engaging in art practice, having an art teacher in high school, Sue Doherty, who just showed me love and care and joy. Art was an act of healing and still is, but it's also it was also for me a way of sharing story. So I didn't necessarily want to say it or feel safe to say it, but it allowed me to make things and share a story that way. And so I think about that now, and all the years of making things, the years of teaching, the years of healing, is thinking about how we engage these conversations through the arts. How do we engage students in making their own picture books about their story, reading about other stories through picture books, writing lyrics, sharing those lyrics. I also think it's part of my ancestors' work to be here, to make sure that we continue to do healing and do this work. I also have to give a shout out to my friends and those educators out there that are also willing to hold space, to have these courageous conversations around indigeneity, around race, around queering up spaces, around talking about how people have different gifts and how we should be honoring those gifts. So I'll give myself this, I do have courage, but there's the people around me and that community around me that supports me, that really helps me to be where I am. And one of the hopes that I have is, I know calls to action 62 and 63 really highlight how educators need to be in talking about residential schools, some of the other things like 60 Scoop, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit. But one of the things that I really have been working with lately on myself and with other educators is that I hope the only story that's being told of Indigenous folk is that of trauma. I hope it's not the only story being told. So that my hope is that it's just not stories of trauma, of being scooped up, put in a residential school, murdered, missing, overrepresented in jails. Yeah, that happens. But it's also stories of survivance, doing this with community, of joy, creativity, intelligence, love. And I think those stories are the best stories of resistance ever, not the poor, pitiful other. And so that's my hope, is that when you engage in that teaching around the truth, that it just doesn't rest there. Right? So I think I'm good for now. And if we want to come back and talk about some art things too, we can.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. So glad to be holding this space with all of you. Again, I'll say that, but yeah, thank you. All right, Jenny Kay.
Yeah, certainly. So I guess the question was around with what has prepared me to hold space for these bold, honest conversations. So thinking back to, I grew up as a teenager, as a child, in silence, meaning that we didn't talk a lot about the culture. We didn't talk a lot about the realities that existed in terms of our histories, or even talk a lot about the current issues that we were living in when I was living back in my home community. But I think through story work, I kind of figured out a way that it was a safe space for me, or a safe opportunity for me to be able to share stories, to share truth, but also to think about leaning on my community and my family, and thinking about, and then reminding me about the whole concept of when you're sharing, you still have to follow certain ethics and protocols, and think about your values as well as a person too. So in writing I'm on a Number, and another story that I worked on more recently, I really started thinking about my responsibility to my community and how to share those stories responsibly. So in so doing, the idea of asking permissions, if it's not my story, for example, that wasn't my story, it was my granny's story, what do permissions look like? And I sort of share that message with other people too, as they're telling stories, and also thinking of ways to do it where you're trying. In my case, is I wanted to share a message or start conversations. The idea of the impacts of colonization, the impacts of the residential school system, sort of thinking about that action and next steps, and what that could look like for when you're reading a story, what people could start thinking of when they're reading a story. So I really started thinking of story work and what that means to me. I really started also thinking about, when we talk about having these bold, honest conversations about the responsibility that also lies with publishers as well too. We can write these stories, but then we go that next step in terms of, not everybody's up to publishing what they might feel is a controversial topic, or a topic that's never been explored before, which, you can do it on your own, you can share the stories, but the reality is, to get that broader reach, publishers also have a responsibility, or those people that also, support artists in sharing their work, have a responsibility too, to really understand that, it's about, what can they do to share and teach, to share our visions, and to share our messages, and share our teachings when it comes to the histories, when it comes to thoughts about identity building and identity loss. When we're thinking about that whole concept of sharing family and community traditions, and thinking about the strength and resistance that exists, and resilience that exists in our communities, and even joy as well too. And what we can do to work in partners to create that change, to create the action. So I think that all the time as I'm writing or as I'm creating art, that within those works, there's messages that exist. So I really try to thoughtfully reflect, each and every word matters, as we're crafting words or as we're drawing those illustrations. Like also do artwork as well too. That everything sends a message, and it could possibly change people's perceptions on things, or to start conversations that have never perhaps happened before, or continue conversations as well too. And there's many spaces that can happen, right? Whether we talk about library settings, community spaces, and that list goes on. And my hope, what people learn from this, from these kind of conversations, or these types of works, for example, is to really reflect on what their responsibility is, right? And what they can do, to help lead that change, no matter how small or big it is. It doesn't matter what role we have in terms of our positions, whether we hold certain jobs, or whether we just have responsibilities in supporting and raising families, or shaping people's minds and stuff. We all can make a difference in what we say and what we share. So yeah, that's just some thoughts.
Thank you. And I think about, responsibility, I think everyone has touched on it, but, responsibility, hey, at the AGO, right? As, education and programming and what we're doing, we are working towards those, the calls, 62 and 63, in the Truth and Reconciliation, commission report, but then also museums, right? There's a 67, call 67 and 70 also. So combining 67 to 70, so combining that within education and programming, and sharing that responsibility with our other educators, but as an institution, leading with art, audience, and learning. That's our, I think that's our position, that's our responsibility. So I'm so glad that each of you have taken this time to share that responsibility with me, to share that responsibility with our audiences. We have a lot of different resources that are out there on the AGO website around learning, and I think our team has posted them somewhere on links, and so you can find a lot there, and then also links to our panelists' work that they were talking about, and action number 83, Robert, thank you as well. So not forgetting, and actually taking it, it's more than a land acknowledgement, right? It's like, okay, these are the steps that we're taking, and really being explicit about that. We're working on it with some great people here at the gallery. So I want to say, let's take a breath. Can we take a breath? Let's take a breath. Let's take a pause. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Jenny Kay. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Robert, for joining me on this journey of learning. My immense gratitude to each of you for taking the time. It is emotional work. It is hard work, but to know that we're doing it is I'm grateful for it, and I can't say thank you enough. So my gratitude goes out to each of you. Yes, Lindsay.
Hi. I just had another thought since we're just
Yes, and we can, and anyone can throw in any other thoughts that
this
yes,
will only
please.
take about 30 minutes. No, just kidding.
Yeah, go. We've got to do it.
This is I was just thinking, this is a really important aspect of educating about residential schools and the history, and is also connecting it to our current reality. So when you step outside of the classroom, and when you're teaching kids about what happened and intergenerational effects, think about those actual realities that when you're going to the mall, and you see uncles and aunties begging on the streets, and lost in addictions, and that type of thing. And it's about not having that fear, and that there's like a danger around there, but it's connecting that history. So when we talk about intergenerational effects, that's sort of a term we throw around quite a bit. So I'll use the example within my family. My kids have never seen us drink. They've never seen us, in violent ways. So they don't know that, but they do know my relatives, my cousins, my aunties and uncles, and sometimes they've seen them in intoxicated. And so I explained to them, this is the effects. Because when I was a kid, I didn't know how to connect that to my dad. I didn't know how to connect those intergenerational effects, because it wasn't until I was in high school, grade 11, that my grade 11 high school social studies teacher introduced us to what colonization meant. And this was in 1998, right? So it's not that long ago. I'm not that old, but it blew my mind. I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know that, my whole life that my dad, was suffering from these effects because of, day school and because of my grandparents in residential school. I didn't know that. I didn't connect those dots. So for Indigenous children, non-Indigenous children, we need to connect those dots when we're out there on the street today and we see our people suffering and we see our people, that are in these ways. It's not just because they choose that life. It's because these effects have hit people in different ways, a lot harder. And so we be gentle, we be compassionate, we offer a bit of money. We offer, I always offer, I don't smoke, but I go buy a pack of smokes for somebody, and I'm not saying that, to encourage that smoking, but with tobacco and in our ways, I show them that, Uncle, I see you here and I know you're a good person and what you've been through, I can't imagine. So I see you and I respect you. So I just wanted to say that when we step out of the classroom, we still have to connect those dots. Hi.
Thank you. Robert or Jenny Kay, do you have any last words that you'd like to say?
I think Lindsay touched on a really important point, the idea that we have to realize the realities that we're also living in today, right? And what responsibility, I'm going to use that word, responsibilities come with that, again, for each and every one of us, and in the way that we reflect on that, because for many of us, we learned about our realities, and we got, later on sort of in life, we weren't raised to understand it all or to walk through it. So for a lot of us, it's either been counseling or it's been a lot of reflections and talking with our family or community members or other people outside of even the community to really understand it. And we're still going through that period of healing and understanding, and it's important that we do it in a good way and an appropriate way, in a respectful way, especially when we're helping to support that next generation as well too. So yeah.
Thank you. Robert?
Add a bit in so much said. That idea of responsibility, and speaking from someone who is working in schools, is the incredible responsibility that as educators working with youth, all youth, we have an incredible responsibility to teaching this work, teaching that truth part, not letting it lie there though, but going into reconciliation and modeling that with your students. So not the students have to, but we all have to. And so I think about that grand responsibility. It's a great responsibility. And, again, going back, thinking about stories, the artworks, the songs that can support you in teaching it. And as I said earlier, it's not only focusing on the trauma, but also on the joy. And taking that responsibility. I'm repeating responsibility a lot intentionally because we can impact students in beautiful ways that continue them to learn and build good relationships with Indigenous peoples, for the non-Indigenous students I'm talking about. Or we can impact them in ways that just further the violence that Indigenous people experience. So I want to emphasize that responsibility again. And you know, I can speak for those of us at TDSB, and I can't speak for other boards because I don't work for other boards, but reach out to us at Urban Indigenous Education Center so we can support you in doing that work. And I know that Audrey and her team is doing some phenomenal stuff in art education, specifically around Indigenous art. And it's done in a beautiful, good way. I've been fortunate enough to have been able to attend some of them. So I know that there's some really good stuff happening. And so I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to repeat responsibility because I just think it's, I mean, it's a term that we all need to really consider. And I also think that, you know, I'm going to wish everyone well on their learning journey and really think about your responsibility. If that's one thing we can, one of the many things that you've given us that you've left with us, you know, in this this hour went by so quickly, but you've given us so much to digest and so much to take in, really personal, really emotional, really, you know, culturally responsive and reflective work that each of you are doing. So I just want to say thank you again, miigwech, 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 and yeah, thank you for joining us, audience. You know, it's been a great conversation on continuing the conversation on residential school. So, thank you all, and I wish you well on your learning journeys. Thank you.